The histogram in our photography is just a graph. It represents the tonal values of our image from pure black to pure white. But perhaps I know what you're thinking, which may be much the same as what I thought when I was first introduced to the histogram. I don't really want any of this technical stuff. I just want to take pictures, not become a mathematician. Well, it is one of those subjects that if you Google it, you can find lots of technical stuff to read, but that can be part of the problem. Now, perhaps some of these things are made more complicated than they need be because the presenter is often more intent on showing off their technical knowledge rather than getting across a practical message. The histogram is not a measure, and there isn't one shape that we should be always striving to achieve. It's just a guide, and it needs to be used in conjunction with the images we're shooting or manipulating. The histogram is something we need to spend just a little time learning about because what it offers is too good to ignore. It's of great benefit to us when the camera is still in our hands, and also when we're sitting in front of our image editors like Photoshop or Lightroom. So let's take a look at the histogram, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Photoshop here to show you the histogram from an image first and then the image afterwards, because what we need to learn is the correlation between the two. So we're looking at a histogram here of an image we'll view in a moment or two in Camera Raw. And this is the histogram, this mountainous shape we see in that little window. Now the left hand side controls the dark pixels right down to black, the right hand side the lighter pixels right up to white, and we've got mid-tones in the middle. So when we look at this particular histogram, it looks reasonably healthy, doesn't it? We've got a nice tall peak, and we've got tone ranging from black on the left to virtually white on the right. So how does this match the image we're going to view? Now here's the image from the histogram, and you can see the histogram repeated at the top of the screen there. Now we can quite clearly see that we've got a fairly well exposed image here. The histogram was telling us that before we even viewed the picture. So that means any manipulation of this image is going to be pretty quick and pretty easy, because all I really need is perhaps a little bit of a clarity, which is mid-tone contrast. I may want a little less exposure to taste, I may want a little bit of vibrance, but you could argue there's our image ready to be opened. When we look at a different histogram and ask ourselves what sort of image is this going to be related to, well, we can see from the range of tones from left to right that it's looking pretty good. Maybe there's a little bit of weakness in the dark tones, but I can see by looking at this histogram that I'm not going to have any problems manipulating this image. Now when we look at the image, we can see that confirmation, because the image is very well exposed, and all I really would need here perhaps is a little bit of blacks for taste, a little bit of that mid-tone contrast again for taste, a little bit of vibrance, and I've got a completed image in seconds, because we're starting off with a well exposed image and the histogram correlated nicely with what we're seeing here. Now what about this histogram? Remember, the dark tones are all on the left, the right tones are all on the right. So this particular image, all the dark tones seem to be stacked up on the left hand side, which is telling me this image is extremely dark. Now the $64,000 question, of course, because we haven't seen the image yet, is this stacked up on the left hand side and dark in tone because we've made a dreadful mistake with the exposure, or is it dark in tone because it's one of those pictures that is dark in tone? Now when we see the image that goes with that particular histogram, it all makes more sense, doesn't it? In this case here, it's not an exposure mistake. We can see by the tones within the cathedral that it's going to be quite natural for those tones in the histogram to be appearing more on the left than the right. And this is a good example where we start to see the correlation between the image and the histogram. And when we think about manipulating an image like this, apart from maybe straightening up some of the converging verticals, which is irrelevant to the exposure we're talking about, a little bit of clarity, which is mid-tone contrast, maybe a little bit of colour, even a little bit of shadow detail, maybe a little adjustment of the exposure, and once again we've got a fairly well exposed image. There's one or two other things we could do, but generally speaking it's going to be quick and easy to manipulate this image. Now when we look at this histogram, we can see that again we've got lots of the dark pixels stacked up on the left hand side. So it does indicate that the image this histogram comes from is going to be more dark in tone. But look over on the right hand side and we've got a peak of light tone as well. Now this makes great sense as soon as we see the image. See what I mean about the correlation between the histogram and what we are seeing? We have to see both together for them to be of help to us. But of course when we're taking the picture, well then we're there on the spot, so we know the type of picture we're shooting, and when we're sitting in front of the computer we're in a similar position. But we can quite clearly see the peak over here is caused by the highlight on the right hand side. But we can also see that the highlight aside, because I was thinking that I would straighten this up and maybe just crop the center part out, but we can see once again all we really need is a little bit of clarity. Maybe we could add a bit of black to taste, and we've again almost got the image just where we need it. So what do we have here? With this particular histogram we've got very low peaks across the majority of the range, which indicates that the contrast is not going to be very high in this image. We've got a deficiency in the dark tones, and we've got a peak in light tones, but also a deficiency in those too. So what sort of image are we going to see that correlates with this particular histogram? Now, can you see what I mean about the correlation between the histogram and the image? When we see the image, there's almost one of those eureka moments. Oh yes, I can see now how the histogram is formed from what we're seeing here. Yes, we've got a bit of a deficiency on the dark tone area and even a little on the light tone area. But of course, we're shooting a snow scene. But you'll notice as well in Camera Raw and also Lightroom, if I put my cursor up into the area where we're deficient, it's telling me where I'm deficient. If you just look below the histogram, you can see the word whites, and up here you can see the word blacks. So all I need to do is to move my whites a little bit to the right, which spreads the histogram, and my blacks a little bit to the left, and suddenly I've got a well exposed and manipulated image, and I know that there's no burnout in the snow and no blocking up of the shadows either. All we would need to do here maybe, and this is just more for taste than right and wrong, maybe just increase the temperature a little bit just to warm it a bit, a little bit of mid-tone contrast with clarity, and once again the image is done. Now I'm showing you the same image in Photoshop's Bridge, and I've got the metadata selected on the left hand side, because here we can see exactly what we saw in some of our experiments in earlier videos. We can see that we've used 160th of a second at f7.1, but the most important bit of information here is that I've stepped in and adjusted the exposure and given one stop more exposure than the camera was prepared to give. And we saw by looking at this in Camera Raw just a moment ago that was the right decision because the manipulation of it is quick, easy and simple. Now here's another histogram where we've got lots of tones stacked up on the left hand side, but we've got some problems on the right hand side as well. We can see that the shadows are creeping up the edge, which means we're beginning to lose shadow detail. Now that's far more acceptable to the eye, generally speaking, than the loss of light tones, but we've also got the loss of some light tones here. Now I can tell you in advance, if we were looking at one image in isolation, what we're looking at here is an exposure mistake. And here's the image that goes with that histogram. So we've been talking quite a bit about what we can see in this particular image in the previous videos. What we've got here is a contrast range that's beginning to get away from us. The exposure we need to give the foreground is so much different from what we need to give the sky that it's difficult to actually capture both of those by just taking one shot. Now I can demonstrate this. First of all, we can see the peak on the right hand side, but it's quite easy to demonstrate that we've got loss of detail here. If we've lost any blacks, that's not going to be absolutely crucial because as I said a few moments ago, generally speaking, we can accept the loss of darker tones probably a little easier than the light tones. If I bring the exposure down here, you can see I could take the exposure completely off, but I'm still not losing the burnt out loss of detail we've got in the sky up there. So there's not a great deal I can do with this image that's not going to take me a fair amount of time. The only thing I can really do here is to repair the sky with copy and paste. So here the manipulation is going to be more lengthy, maybe a little more tricky, and on occasions it can be outside of the author's current skill level to do the work that needs to be done. Now I told you a little white lie when this image opened up, saying that it was an exposure mistake. If this image had been shot as an isolated image, then clearly it is an exposure error. But as you can see by what's popped up on the left hand side, I took 3 different exposures here. So this one here was shot with an exposure that the camera felt was correct for the scene. This one here was given an exposure which was 1 stop less than what the camera really wanted to give. Now we can see that that's going to affect the shadow area quite considerably because of the contrast range now being a little bit too high. And even with 1 stop less exposure, when I bring the exposure down here, although the burnout in that area may be a little bit less, I still cannot get rid of it completely. If I go to this version, that is 2 stops less exposure than the original one. And again, I've got problems in the shadow areas because if I bring down the exposure, even now with 2 stops less exposure, I've improved the situation in the sky, but I certainly haven't eradicated it. And of course, at the same time, I've given myself a problem where I would need to raise up the detail from the foreground, and when we do that we quite often bring up problems such as noise, as we can see here, all around the shadow detail, and I think you can see it quite clearly on the enlargement I have here. Here's another histogram where the information is telling us that there's an awful lot of white tones within this image. And again, a little bit of a discrepancy on the left hand side with the black tones. But we've got a bit of a peak here that seems to be cut off. So let's take a look at the image, and I don't think this is going to be much of a surprise. Another snow scene. So I think when we think about the histogram we looked at in Photoshop, or the one we can see at the top right of the screen, when we see the picture, I think we have another one of those oh yes moments when we suddenly see the correlation between the two. But we can quite clearly see now that the manipulation of this image isn't going to be that tricky. We may want a little bit of blacks to take the histogram a little bit more to the left. We may want to drop the exposure a little bit. We may want to push the whites and the highlights just to bring those peaks out, because we know we're not going to lose detail until that little white light coming on up there on the top right. Keep away from that and you know that you've got tone everywhere. And we could warm the image and a little bit of clarity, a bit of vibrance. Not too difficult or time consuming to produce an image which is typical of what we would see in the snow. I said earlier on in the introduction to this particular video that the histogram isn't a measuring tool. And if we look at a histogram like this, we can't tell just by looking at the histogram whether we've got a really bad exposure error or we've got an image shot in non-normal or non-standard conditions. Let's take a look, and I think once again everything will become clear. Well, it's not a mistake. We're in an old steam railway yard, photographing dark subjects in a dark corner. And we can see now, when we see the image and the correlation between that and the histogram, that once again we don't have too many problems with this particular image. Once again, a little mid-tone contrast with clarity, maybe a little tweak of the vibrance, maybe a little tweak of the highlights, maybe a little tweak of the whites, and may even be a little bit of exposure, and we've got an image which is ready to open up in Photoshop. When our exposure is the best we can get for the content, image and lighting that we were faced with, then the image editing is usually pretty easy. Here's yet another histogram, and as I've said a number of times, just by looking at the histogram we can't tell whether this was done by design, whether it's a dreadful exposure mistake, or perhaps there's another reason behind it. Now, as soon as you see the image that goes with this particular histogram, you could be mistaken for saying, well, it's a dreadful exposure mistake. Well, I suppose it is in a way, but I think this is one of those scenes where the contrast is so high it's out of control. It doesn't matter really what we did in this situation. In most circumstances, we're not going to be able to capture the highlights and the shadows to the level that we need to create a good image. What we have to bear in mind when we're looking at an image like this is the contrast range we're currently seeing now is not what I saw when I framed up on this image. But it's almost beyond capturing this, because if we darken down the exposure to get the highlights, we've got to go so far that the shadows are going to be really bad. If we'd have exposed for the highlights, the shadows would be even worse. But if I tried to bring the shadows up and the exposure up, ignore the highlights for a moment, if I tried to do that and then we look at the shadows, we've got that terrible noise again. So if we're trying to raise detail from shadows, we almost always have problems, but when we're trying to darken light tones down, we tend to be able to cope with that much easier. But here's an image where the contrast range of the scene, brilliant sunshine coming through an open door into a shed that's deep in shadow. Nobody could capture all of those tones perfect without some specialist ways of doing it. So I'm going to make this one the last histogram. So what do we make of what the graph is showing us? Well, we're obviously going to see an image with a lot of light tones. We have a deficiency in dark tones, and I'll ask the question again, how do we know whether this is a dreadful mistake or it's by design? Well, we don't by looking at the histogram in isolation. It's only when we see the histogram in relation to the image can we tell. And when we see the image, everything drops into place because this was by design. Taken on a very misty morning on the Newmarket Gallops, which is where they exercise the racehorses not far from Newmarket Racecourse in Cambridgeshire, England. So it's quite okay to see the histogram looking like this, given the subject we've taken and the conditions we've taken it in. It's one of those images that probably doesn't get much help from the colour, so we could argue that this is one of those images that's best seen as a monochrome. But it's also one of those black and white images which looks pretty good without having a pure white and without having a pure black, because it's a misty scene. If we tried to use image editing techniques here to put the histogram in the centre and get a spread from one side to another, we're going to destroy all of the charm that the misty conditions gives us, because I'd need to drop the exposure down, I'd need to move the highlights up, the whites up, and you can see I'm having to move the sliders a long way, shadows too, blacks as well. But then we start to lose most of the charm that inspired us to reach for our camera in the first place. Now in Camera Raw I'm going to touch my Alt key and reset all of those, and I'll just take that saturation off again, because when it comes to looking at the histogram we need to be viewing the image at the same time. Well, when we've got our camera in front of us and we're taking the shots, the image is definitely there, or the scene is there, and it's the same when we're in Photoshop. But it's a little bit too late to view it from a correction point of view then, because really we want to start doing this process when we're pressing the shutter button. So if your camera allows you to see the histogram on the back of the camera, turn it on and leave it on, because you'll find after a while this correlation between the two, which I keep going on and on and on about, becomes second nature to you. Then it becomes a great help. Let's bring this video to a close by just taking a quick look at a rather large thumbnail of the original raw untouched file, but more importantly the metadata at the top left. And the important thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that here we have a situation where the camera, left to its own devices, would have given this image 1 1/3 stop less exposure. So what I've done, looking at the misty scene, I've stepped in and I've set a compensation of plus 1.33, and as you've seen, it's just about right. When you can be standing in front of the scene you're about to photograph, and before you raise your camera to your eye, you're saying to yourself, this isn't a normal situation, I'm going to have to watch the exposure here, you're 50% of the way there. When you can stand in front of a scene and say straight away, I'm going to need at least a stop more exposure here or a stop less exposure, and you start shooting with the compensation already inbuilt, then you're 90% of the way to understanding exposure.